Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
The guy next door moved in about 6 months ago. Seemed normal enough at first. We'd wave, do the whole polite neighbor thing. But then the parking situation started. See, our driveways are right next to each other, and there's not a ton of space between them. Most people park their cars centered in their own driveway. Maybe a little to one side, whatever. No big deal. But this guy has this absolutely massive pickup truck. Like one of those huge ones that looks like it could hold a small building, and for some reason, he started parking it just slightly over the line into my driveway space. At first, I thought maybe he just misjudged it one time. It happens, right? But then it kept happening every single day. And I'm not talking about blocking me in completely. That would have been too obvious. No, he parked it just enough over the edge that I could technically still get my car out, but I had to do this absolutely ridiculous multi-point turn every morning to avoid scraping either his truck or my car. I'm not a morning person to begin with, and having to do this elaborate parking lot maneuver before I've even had coffee was driving me up the wall. It added like 5 minutes to my morning routine, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're already running late and you just want to get to the coffee shop before your first meeting, those 5 minutes feel like forever. After about a week of this, I decided to be an adult about it and just talk to him. I caught him one evening when he was getting home from work, kept it super casual and friendly. I mentioned that his truck had been parked a little over into my driveway space and that it was making it kind of tough for me to get out in the mornings. He apologized right away and said he didn't realize it was a problem. He told me he'd watch that and thanked me for saying something. I walked away feeling pretty good about it. Problem solved through civil communication. Exactly how it's supposed to work. Except the next morning his truck was in the exact same spot. And the morning after that. And every morning for the next 2 weeks. I gave it some time thinking maybe he just forgot or maybe he was on autopilot when parking. We all have our routines and sometimes it takes a while to break them. But after 3 weeks of continuing to do my ridiculous morning dance around his truck, I was getting pretty frustrated. So I tried again. This time I was a little more direct about it. I told him I hated to bring this up again, but his truck was still parked over my driveway line and it had been making it really hard for me to get out every morning. And this is where it got annoying. He looked at his truck, looked at my driveway, then looked back at me with this completely unbothered expression. He pointed out that there was still enough room for me to get out. I explained that technically yeah, but I had to do like a 5-point turn to avoid hitting anything. He asked if I could get out though, right? I just stared at him for a second, waiting for him to realize how ridiculous he sounded. He didn't. I told him it would be a lot easier if he could just park a little more centered in his own driveway. He simply said it was fine how it was, and then he just turned around and walked back inside his house. Just like that. Conversation over. I stood there feeling completely dumbfounded. Who does that? Who gets told they're making their neighbor's life harder and just goes, hey, not my problem? So that was it. I tried being nice twice, and clearly that wasn't working. For the next 3 months, every single morning, I did my annoying multi-point turn. Every single morning I got more irritated. I started leaving earlier just to account for the extra time. I even looked up if there were any local ordinances about driveway parking, but since he wasn't technically blocking me, there was nothing I could do officially. Then last Tuesday, I was working from home and took a break to grab lunch. I looked out my window and saw him outside doing yard work. His truck was parked in its usual obnoxious spot, and something in me just snapped. Not in an angry way, more like a, you know what, I'm done being the only reasonable person here kind of way. I grabbed my car keys, went outside and parked my car directly behind his truck in the street. I made sure I wasn't blocking his driveway, wasn't parked illegally, wasn't doing anything that could get me in trouble. I was just parked in a completely legal spot that happened to make it really inconvenient for him to back his truck out. He'd have to do some serious maneuvering to get around my car. I went back inside and got back to work, honestly not expecting anything to happen right away. But 20 minutes later there was knocking on my door. Persistent knocking. I took my time getting up, took my time walking to the door. When I opened it, there he was, looking annoyed. He asked me to move my car because I was blocking him in. I looked past him at the situation, then back at him. I smiled, the biggest, friendliest smile I could manage. I told him that there was still room and that he just had to do a few extra turns to get out. I watched his face go through this amazing journey of emotions. Confusion, then recognition, then frustration, then something that might have been embarrassment. He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, then closed it. Opened it again, closed it again. He tried saying that it wasn't the same thing, that it was different. I asked him if it really was though and whether he could get out or not. He stared at me for a solid 10 seconds, and I just kept smiling. Finally, he turned around and went back to his truck without another word. I watched from my window as he did this elaborate series of back and forth maneuvers to get his truck out without hitting my car. It took him a good 5 minutes. That was a week ago. His truck hasn't been anywhere near my driveway line since. Now it's parked perfectly centered in his own space, exactly where it should have been all along. We haven't spoken since then, and honestly, I'm fine with that. My mother and I would always go at it constantly growing up, screaming matches that could wake the entire neighborhood, insults flying back and forth like we were trying to win some kind of terrible competition. She had this temper that could go from 0 to nuclear in seconds, and unfortunately, I inherited it. We were both awful to each other during those years. When I finally moved out in my early 20s, it felt like I could breathe for the first time. Away from that toxic environment, I started working on myself. I went to therapy, read books about emotional regulation, practiced meditation, all that stuff people recommend when you're trying to not be an angry mess anymore. And it worked. By my late 20s, I was a different person. Calmer, more centered, actually, capable of walking away from conflict instead of diving headfirst into it. Then life threw me a curveball. I lost my job during a company-wide layoff, and my savings weren't enough to cover rent in the city I was living in. I had two options: move back in with my mother temporarily while I got back on my feet, or risk homelessness. So I swallowed my pride and moved back home. I told myself it would be fine. I was different now. I had tools to handle her outbursts. I could be the bigger person. Turns out my mother hadn't changed at all. The first few weeks were tolerable. We kept to ourselves mostly, and I spent most of my time in my room applying for jobs and doing freelance work. But then the incident started. She'd blow up over the smallest things. I'd leave a dish in the sink for 20 minutes and she'd explode. I'd come home 5 minutes later than I said I would, and she'd lose it. I'd use the bathroom when she apparently needed as it, and suddenly I was the worst person alive. At first, I tried all my de-escalation techniques. When she'd start yelling, I'd tell her that she was being really hurtful and ask if we could please talk about this respectfully. She'd shoot back that I shouldn't tell her how to talk in her own house, that I was ungrateful, and that she let me live there, and this was how I treated her. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to fight and that we should discuss things when we were both calm. She'd insist she was calm and that I was the problem, that I'd always been the problem. When that didn't work, I tried just removing myself from the situation. I'd say goodnight and walk to my room, hoping she'd cool off. But she'd follow me down the hallway, screaming the whole way, then stand outside my door pounding on it and continuing her tirade. I'd sit on my bed with headphones on, trying to drown her out, but I could still feel the vibrations of her fists hitting the door. After a few weeks of this, I started getting creative. When she'd yell something that made no logical sense, I'd point out the contradiction with this bored, detached tone. Like when she screamed that I never helped around the house right after watching me clean the entire kitchen. I'd mention that it was interesting since I'd just spent an hour cleaning. She'd snap that it didn't count because I didn't do it right. I'd clarify that meant I did help, just not to her standards, which was different from never helping. She'd accuse me of twisting her words. It was mildly entertaining for a while, but it didn't actually stop her from yelling. Nothing did. She just kept coming at me, night after night, finding new reasons to explode. It was exhausting. Then came the water incident. I've been in my room all evening working on a project with a tight deadline. Around 11 at night, I realized I was dehydrated and went to the kitchen for some water. I filled my glass, took a few sips right there by the sink, and was about to head back to my room when my mother came in. She stopped in the doorway and just stared at me. She asked what I was doing. I told her I was getting water. She said she needed to get something and I was in her way. I said okay and that I was heading back to my room anyway, then told her good night. I walked past her toward the hallway, and that's when it started. She said it was so typical of me, always in the way, always making things difficult. I repeated that I was just getting water and that I was going to bed now, saying good night again. She told me not to walk away from her when she was talking to me. I kept walking. I heard her footsteps behind me when I went down the hall. I got to my room, went inside and locked the door. My heart wasn't even racing. I'd become so numb to these outbursts that my nervous system barely registered them anymore. I just felt tired. I stripped off my clothes. I've always slept without them, find it more comfortable, and got into bed. I was just pulling the covers up when the pounding started. She banged on the door and screamed at me to open it. She yelled about how dare I walk away from her, how disrespectful I was, how she gave me life and let me live there. She demanded I open the door right now. I lay there staring at the ceiling. I had work in the morning, an important video call at 8. I needed sleep. She continued screaming that she knew I could hear her, calling me ungrateful and selfish. I told her through the door that I was in bed, naked, and ready to sleep. I warned her that if she kept screaming, I would come out there exactly like I was, and she would not like it. There was a brief pause. Then she shouted that I wouldn't dare and demanded I open the door. I sighed. I really didn't want to do this, but she wasn't stopping and I was out of options. I threw back the covers, walked to the door, unlocked it, and swung it wide open. I just stood there, completely naked, completely calm, making direct eye contact. My mother's face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. Shock, horror, confusion, and then this deep, almost purple color I'd never seen on a human being before. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. The screaming stopped, then she turned around without a word and walked straight to her bedroom. I heard her door close. I shut my door, locked it, and went back to bed. The next morning she acted like nothing had happened. She made breakfast, asked if I wanted coffee, and talked about the weather. Normal conversation. And she never yelled at me again. Not once during the remaining 2 months I lived there. I have no idea what happened in her brain at that moment. Maybe seeing me that vulnerable, yet completely unbothered, broke whatever pattern she'd been stuck in. Maybe it was just so absurd that it reset something. Whatever the reason, I moved out 8 weeks later into a new apartment, and our relationship has been civil ever since. We talk on the phone once a week, and she's actually pleasant now. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years now. When I first bought the house, it needed a lot of work. The roof was leaking, the plumbing was ancient, and the driveway was cracked beyond repair. Over the years, I fixed everything except the driveway. It wasn't that I didn't want to fix it, but between my job as a warehouse supervisor and taking care of my elderly father who lives with me, I just never had the extra money to pour concrete. My plan was always to get it done eventually, but for now, I parked my 2 cars on the street like half the neighborhood does. My neighbor moved in about 6 months ago. From day one, she made it clear she thought she owned the entire block. She complained about kids riding bikes too loudly, about people's trash cans being visible from the street, about dogs barking, but her real obsession became my cars. It started small. One morning, I was loading my father into my car for his doctor's appointment when she walked over. She asked me if I really needed to park both my cars on the street. I told her good morning and explained that my driveway wasn't usable right now. She said it was an eyesore and that I should park in my driveway like normal people. I explained that the driveway was cracked and I was planning to fix it when I could afford it. She said that wasn't her problem and that I was taking up valuable street parking. I looked up and down the street. There were at least a dozen empty spots. I pointed out that there was plenty of parking available. She said that wasn't the point and that it looked trashy having cars parked on the street all the time. I told her I wasn't breaking any laws and that the street was public parking. She huffed and walked away. Over the next few weeks, she escalated. She left notes on my windshield telling me to move my cars. She knocked on my door at random times to complain. She even called the police once, but the officer just told her I had every right to park on a public street. That seemed to make her angrier. Then things got weird. She started taking pictures of my cars every day. I'd see her standing on her porch with her phone pointed at my vehicles. When I asked her what she was doing, she just said she was documenting the neighborhood's decline. About a week ago, she came over with a new tactic. She told me she'd talked to the homeowners association. I reminded her that we didn't have a homeowners association. She said we should have one, and that she was starting one, and the first rule would be no street parking. I told her she couldn't just create rules for a whole neighborhood. She said to watch her, and that if I didn't move those cars, there would be trouble. I asked if that was a threat. She said it was a promise. I didn't take her seriously. I mean, what was she going to do? But I should have known better. 3 days ago, I woke up at 6 in the morning to the sound of jackhammering. I looked out my window and saw something I couldn't believe. There was a guy in a dirty tank top and jeans using a jackhammer to tear up the asphalt directly in front of my house. Big chunks of street were already destroyed, and he was still going. I ran outside in my pajamas and asked him what the hell he was doing. The guy didn't even stop, but the jackhammer was too loud. I had to wave my arms to get his attention. He finally turned it off and asked what I wanted. I repeated my question about what he was doing to the street. He said he got hired to dig this up. I asked if the city hired him. He said no, some lady paid him cash. My stomach dropped. I asked if it was the woman from the house next door and pointed at her place. He shrugged and said maybe, that he didn't ask questions, and that she said this needed to be dug up. I told him this was a public street and he couldn't just destroy it. He said he got paid, and it wasn't his problem. He started up the jackhammer again. I pulled out my phone and called the police. While I waited, I saw her watching from her window with this satisfied smirk on her face. 2 police cars showed up within 15 minutes. The officers made the guy stop working and asked for permits. Of course, he didn't have any. He didn't have authorization from the city, no permits, nothing. He kept saying he was just doing a job he was hired for. The officer asked who hired him. The guy said he didn't know. Just some lady. The officer said they were going to need more information than that. The guy started getting nervous. He clearly realized he was in trouble. He said he was just trying to make some money and that the lady from the house over there paid him $500 to dig up this section of street. The officer asked me if that was my neighbor. I confirmed it was. They went to her door and knocked. She answered with this fake innocent expression. The officer asked if she hired someone to damage the street. She said she had no idea what they were talking about. The officer told her they had a witness who said she paid him to dig up the asphalt. She said that was ridiculous and asked why she would do that. I spoke up and said it was because she'd been harassing me for months about parking on the street. She said she'd done no such thing. The guy who'd been digging suddenly spoke up. He told her she gave him cash that morning and told him to make sure the street in front of my house was completely torn up so I couldn't park there anymore. Her face went red. She said he was lying. He said she paid him with bills that had a rubber band around them and that she wrote her phone number on a piece of paper in case he needed to reach her. He said he still had it in his truck. The officer asked him to get it. Sure enough, he came back with a crumpled paper with her phone number on it. The officers checked and it matched. She tried to backtrack, saying he was confused, that maybe she'd talked to him about something else. But the damage to the street was right there, and multiple neighbors had come out to confirm they'd seen her talking to this guy early that morning. The officers arrested them both. The guy for destruction of public property and working without permits. Her for conspiracy and destruction of public property. She screamed the whole time about how this was unfair, how I was the real problem, how the neighborhood was going downhill because of people like me. The city came out later that day to assess the damage. Turns out fixing the street is going to cost thousands. The city official told me they'd be pursuing full restitution from her. My father watched the whole thing from the living room window. When the police cars finally drove away, he just shook his head and said, "Some people have too much time and not enough sense. The street's still torn up, but the city says they'll have it fixed within a week. My cars are still parked right where they've always been, on the public street where I have every legal right to park them." I'm 30 years old, and 6 weeks ago I gave birth to my daughter. She's my first baby, and honestly, she's perfect. But nobody really tells you how hard those first weeks are going to be. Sure, people say it's tough and you'll be tired, but that doesn't even begin to cover it. The birth itself was complicated. I ended up needing an emergency cesarean section after laboring for 18 hours. Recovery has been rough. I'm still in pain when I move certain ways, and my doctor told me I need to take it easy for at least another month. On top of that, my daughter has her days and nights mixed up, so I'm lucky if I get 3 hours of sleep in a row. My hormones are all over the place too. One minute I'm fine, the next I'm crying because I burned toast. It's a mess. My husband has been helpful when he can be, but he had to go back to work after 2 weeks. So most days it's just me and the baby trying to figure out this whole motherhood thing while my body is still healing. Now onto the situation. I have this friend who I've known since college. Let's call her Karen because, well, you'll see why. She is 31 and pregnant with her first baby. She's due in about 3 months, and she's been planning her baby shower for weeks now. About 2 weeks ago, she came over to visit. I was exhausted. I hadn't showered in 2 days. I was wearing the same milk-stained shirt I'd slept in, and my house looked like a tornado had hit it. But she is my friend, so I let her in. We sat down, and after about 5 minutes of her cooing over my daughter, she got to the real reason for her visit. She told me she wanted to talk about her baby shower. I asked if she'd picked a date yet. That's when she dropped the bomb and said she wanted to have it at my place. I honestly thought I'd misheard her. I asked her to repeat what she'd just said. She explained that my house was perfect for it because I had a nice big living room and a great backyard. She also said I was good at planning events and reminded me how amazing my wedding had been. Then she added that since I already had all the baby stuff set up, it would be super easy to decorate with a baby theme. I told her I didn't think I could do that right now. She asked why not and said I was already home anyway. She kept insisting it would be easy. I tried to stay calm and explain my situation. I told her I was still recovering from the birth and that it had been a cesarean. I mentioned that I wasn't supposed to be doing a lot of physical activity and that, with the baby and everything, I barely had time to keep up with laundry, let alone plan and host a whole party. She brushed off my concerns and said it wasn't like I'd be doing it alone. She said she'd help with the planning, though she quickly added that she obviously couldn't do any heavy lifting since she was pregnant. I told her again that I really didn't think I was up for it. I suggested maybe having it at someone else's place or renting a venue. I even offered to chip in some money to help pay for it. Her whole demeanor changed. She asked if I was serious. I tried to apologize and explain that I just didn't have the energy for it, but she cut me off. She said I was making excuses and that it wasn't that hard to host a party. She insisted I literally just had to let people come over and that she wasn't asking me to do everything myself. I explained that I would still have to clean my house, prepare food, set up decorations, and coordinate with guests. I told her that was a lot right now when I was barely sleeping and still in pain. She shot back that other moms do it and mentioned that her sister-in-law had hosted a dinner party just 2 weeks after having her baby. I told her good for her sister-in-law, but I wasn't her. I said clearly that I couldn't do this. She stood up, and I could see her face was red. She said she couldn't believe I was being so selfish. She reminded me that she had thrown my entire bridal shower at her apartment, that she'd spent weeks planning it and paid for most of it herself without complaining once. I acknowledged how grateful I was for that, but I pointed out that it had been 4 years ago and I hadn't been recovering from major surgery while taking care of a newborn at the time. She told me to forget it and that she'd figure it out herself. Then she said this was really disappointing and that she thought we were better friends than this. She left without even saying goodbye to my daughter. Over the next few days, I started getting messages from mutual friends. Karen had been telling everyone that I refused to help her with her baby shower because I was too good for her now or something like that. A few people reached out saying I should reconsider and that friendships were about being there for each other. Then 3 days ago, Karen sent me a long message. She said she'd been thinking about this a lot and really thought I needed to reconsider. She went on about how she was pregnant and stressed, and that I, of all people, should understand how hard it was. She called me incredibly selfish for putting my own comfort over helping a friend in need. She reminded me that she'd always been there for me and asked if this was how I was repaying her by abandoning her when she needed me most. Then she gave me an ultimatum. She said if I didn't agree to host her shower, she didn't think we could be friends anymore. She told me I needed to think about what was more important, a little bit of inconvenience for me or our entire friendship. I was furious. I showed my husband, and he was shocked too. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I sent her a message back telling her that our friendship clearly didn't mean much if she was willing to throw it away because I couldn't host a party while recovering from surgery. I told her I hoped she found someone to host her shower, but I was done feeling guilty about taking care of myself and my baby. She responded by blocking me on everything. But here's where it gets interesting. Yesterday, I got a call from another friend who was supposed to be Karen's co-host at whatever venue she'd found. Turns out Karen had told multiple people that they were hosting her shower. She promised each of them that the others would do most of the work. When they all got together to plan and realized what she'd done, they all backed out. Now she's apparently scrambling to find anyone willing to help her, and people are starting to see what she's really like. When I first started working, I thought the salary was fair for an entry-level position. But 3 years in, with all the extra responsibilities I'd taken on and the certifications I'd earned, I was still making the same $85,000 I started with. I brought it up during my annual reviews, and my supervisor would always nod sympathetically and say something about budget constraints and how he'd see what he could do. Nothing ever changed. The worst part was watching new hires come in making nearly what I made, despite having less experience. I trained 2 of them myself and both were making around $78,000 to start. It didn't make sense that I was only $7,000 ahead of people I was teaching. Then one day, after I'd stayed late to fix a critical system issue for the 3rd time that week, my supervisor called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, which wasn't like him at all. He closed the door behind me, which was unusual. He told me he was going to be straight with me because he didn't want to lose me. He asked if I knew how the company worked with raises. I said we basically didn't get them. He corrected me, explaining that it wasn't exactly like that. The thing was, management had this unwritten policy where they wouldn't give substantial raises unless you had a competing offer from another company. He admitted it was stupid, but that's how they operated. He explained that he'd seen good people leave over the years because of this exact policy. He said he'd been fighting for me in budget meetings, but upper management wouldn't budge without external pressure. I stared at him for a moment, trying to process what he was telling me. I asked him if he was saying I needed to interview at other places just to get paid what I'm worth here. He confirmed that was the only way management would budge. He added that between us, I should be making at least $110,000 based on what I do for them. He told me he'd tried pushing it through the normal channels multiple times. He even showed me the emails he'd sent to his director, all of them rejected with the same response about budget limitations. I left his office feeling frustrated and honestly a bit insulted. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to spend my evenings and weekends interviewing at companies I had no interest in working for just to prove my value. It felt like a waste of everyone's time. That night, I was complaining about it to some friends over drinks when I had an idea. My old supervisor, the one who'd originally hired me, had left about a year ago to take a position at another company. We'd stayed in touch, grabbing lunch every few months. He was a good guy, and more importantly, he knew exactly what I was capable of. He'd always told me I was underpaid, even back when he was my boss, but his hands had been tied by the same policies. I called him the next morning around 9 a.m. He greeted me cheerfully and asked what was up and if everything was okay. I told him everything was fine mostly, and that I needed a favor that was going to sound weird. I explained the whole situation to him, how the company wouldn't give raises without competing offers, and how I didn't actually want to leave but needed to get paid fairly. He laughed and said he wasn't surprised at all. He said it was ridiculous, but that he could help me out. He told me to send him my updated resume and that he'd draft up an offer letter from his company. He asked how much I should actually be making. I told him that based on the market rate for someone with my experience and skills, probably around $110,000. He paused for a moment, then said he'd take care of it and told me not to worry about a thing. He mentioned that he still had contacts in my department and knew roughly what they could afford. A few days later, I got an email from him with an official-looking offer letter attached. The subject line read, "Your opportunity at our company," and it looked completely legitimate. I didn't read it too carefully because I was running late for a meeting, but I saw it was there and figured I'd give it to my supervisor the next day. The following morning, I walked into my supervisor's office with my laptop. I reminded him about the conversation we'd had, about needing a competing offer, and told him I'd gotten one. He seemed surprised at how fast that was and asked where it was from. I told him it was from my old supervisor's company and asked if I could forward him the letter. He nodded, and I sent it over right from my phone. He opened it on his computer, and I watched his eyebrows climb up his forehead. His eyes widened as he read through it. He said the offer was for $125,000. I asked him what he meant and if it was really that much. I pulled up the email on my phone and looked at it properly for the first time. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. $125,000 annual salary. The letter also included benefits details, a sign-on bonus of $10,000, and a start date 3 weeks out. It looked completely real, down to the company letterhead and the signature at the bottom. I felt my stomach drop a little, worried that maybe I'd asked for too much. He told me he'd talk to upper management and get back to me by the end of the day. He said he needed to move fast on this because they couldn't afford to lose me. I went back to my desk feeling nervous. Had my old supervisor made a mistake? Would they even be able to match that number? Maybe I'd aimed too high and now they'd just let me walk. I tried to focus on work but kept checking my email and watching my supervisor's office. I saw him on the phone several times throughout the morning, and around 11 a.m. he disappeared into the director's office. They were in there for almost an hour. Around 4 in the afternoon, my supervisor called me back into his office. He was smiling, which I took as a good sign. He told me he'd gone to bat for me, showed them the offer, explained how valuable I was, and mentioned all the late nights and emergency fixes I'd handled. He said he'd also reminded them about the 2 major projects I'd led that saved the company over $200,000 last year. He said management had agreed to counter. I asked what they were offering. He asked how $130,000 sounded. I nearly fell out of my chair. That was $20,000 more than what I thought I should be making and $45,000 more than my current salary. It was also a 53% raise from where I started. I asked if he was serious. He confirmed he was serious and explained that they really didn't want to lose me. He said the director had even commented that they should have done this sooner. He said they could have the paperwork ready by the end of the week and the new salary would be effective the 1st of next month. He also mentioned they were throwing in an extra week of vacation time. I thanked him and told him I'd think about it overnight, even though I already knew I was staying. Later that evening, I called my old supervisor to thank him and tell him I wouldn't be taking his offer. He was laughing on the other end of the phone and said, of course, I wasn't taking it because it was fake. He explained that he knew what my department's budget looked like because he used to work there. He knew they could afford to pay me more, they just wouldn't unless they had to. He said he'd actually checked with some of his old colleagues still at the company and found out they'd recently increased the department budget by almost $300,000. So he put down $125,000 because he figured they'd counter high to make sure they kept me. He said he knew they'd go higher if they thought they might lose me to a competitor. He said it looked like it worked even better than he expected. I told him he was insane and thanked him. He said I deserved it and to consider it payback for all those times I bailed him out when he was there. He also made me promise that if I ever had other colleagues in the same situation, I'd help them out the same way. That happened 5 years ago. My new salary changed everything. I was finally able to save properly, pay off my student loans, and even buy a house. More importantly, I felt valued at work for the first time in years. My supervisor and I still laugh about it sometimes, though we keep it between us. Last month, my old supervisor called me again. He's at a third company now, much bigger than either of our previous employers, and they were looking for an executive to run their operations division. He wanted to know if I'd be interested. The salary he mentioned was $210,000 plus bonuses and stock options. This time the offer was completely real. I gave my notice 2 weeks ago, and my current company tried to counter again, offering me $170,000 to stay. But I knew it was time to move on. I start next month, and I'm not even nervous about negotiating salary this time. My old supervisor and I have already discussed compensation, and there were no games involved. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.